Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones, and I'm glad that you're here. Thanks for coming. We are finishing Mark 12 in our ongoing series, Translation Notes. We've done some other books. We did 2 Timothy. Actually, I think that was the only other whole book we did, but we've done some dabbling in the Septuagint and in the Hebrew Bible, but we have been pretty consistent in going through Mark. We have some passages from 2 and 3, those chapters that we'll have to circle back around and make up. But today we finish Mark 12, which is pretty amazing to me. We come up next time on the challenging to interpret chapter 13. But today we wrap up chapter 12. Jesus is still in the temple, and we have just heard Jesus say, if we can go back a bit here, he's been talking about experts in the law and how they devour widows' houses, and for a show they make lengthy prayers. And now we're going to see a widow in action. Jesus is going to use her actions as a teaching moment, hold her up as a model to the disciples, and in so doing, Mark will do that for all of his readers, which include us today. So that's what we're looking at. 2 small copper coins is what this is about. Sort of I'd say a well-loved Bible story, even in traditions that maybe aren't as biblically aware. This has kind of made its way into a larger cultural setting. So that's Mark 12, 41 through 44 that we'll do. Just to recap kind of what this webinar is about, I focus us on lexical and grammatical questions that arise when translating the Greek text of Mark into English. So lexical would be at the word level. What does this word mean? This word means this. If it's used this way, it could mean something else here. How do we decide? So we'll do that today. And then grammatical questions. One example today is we've got a plural subject that takes, actually it has a singular pronoun referred to it and a singular verb. And so we're gonna wonder about that. I mean, there's actually a very simple explanation, but those are the kinds of questions that come up when we're translating. So that's the focus today. This is less focused on the features of accordance per se than some of our other webinars. If you are interested in something more feature focused, if you go to the help menu in your Accordance app, and this is all on desktop, by the way, your help menu will take you to the webinars link where we've got all kinds of pre-recorded webinars. You can see them all there. If I click on that, it will open it up in the web browser in app. The Western Hemisphere friendly webinars have all of mine, and you can see them here. If you just scroll down, here we are live right now, but this will include all of the other recordings to the Mark translation notes. All right, let me know if you have comments or questions, and the way that you do that, either now or throughout the webinar, is by using the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. When you logged in, you ought to have seen the GoToWebinar control panel, and one of the little sections there is questions. That's a typed chat where you can put in comments or questions at any time, and I'll respond, if not right away, certainly as we go. I think that covers it. I'll also just note that today is being recorded, and so when the recording processes, you will get access to the recording, and also this handout will come to you via email. If you're here live, you can find this handout as well in the handouts section of the control panel. If you're watching on a recording later, you can email me for it, or you can also find it here. Everything is at tinyurl.com/Mark translation notes. All right, well, that's enough prefatory material. If someone wants to just confirm in the questions box that you are in fact seeing my screen and hearing me and have the handout, that would be great. I'll assume that that's the case and proceed. Mark 12:41 is where we pick up. And I'm going to go to Accordance for this. This workspace that I'm showing here is, you can see I named it 2022 Mark Greek, and that's because I set up this workspace back in 2022. It's one that I often use in preparation for this webinar. So I've got all kinds of tools here that we may cycle through at some point, but I'll just for now go to this Greek text and read from that. Let me close the NIV. We don't need all these translations open. All right, so this is our passage today. It fits on a screen. I mean, it even fits on a small part of a screen, so it's not a whole lot of text. But we'll start with verse 41. I'll make that a little bigger and read through it. Kai kathisas katenanti to gazophulakiou Theore pos haaklos bale kalkan estagazaphulakion. Say that 5 times fast. Kai paloi plusioi ebalan pala. Let's go left to right here. And you've got kai, so and or then, sitting, participle, Jesus, opposite the collection box, treasury. We'll come back to that. Then we have theore. He saw how the crowd is throwing money, bronze collections into the same word here, offering plate, treasury. And many rich, so many rich people, so plusioi, the oi, omicron iota ending there shows us that's masculine plural nominative, and that is matched here by the adjective. Ebalan pala, they were throwing in or putting in much or a lot. All right, let's get at a more fluid translation. Then, sitting down opposite the offering box, Jesus saw how the crowd was putting money into the collection box, and many rich people put in a lot. We'll start with Kai. I translate it as then for a new scene. And again, this is all kind of the same. I mean, if this were a TV show, it would very much be the same episode united by theme. He's still in the temple. He's grappling with the various religious leaders. He's correcting them where needed. He's affirming the one who got the greatest commandments right. And now what he's going to do is pretty subversive to look not to one of the leaders for an example, or not one of the rich people, or even one of the many people throwing money in. He's going to look to this widow. So that is, I would say, a new scene that I think warrants then, or even next, or even after that. I don't think that's over translating Kai. This is a very flexible word in Greek. If you want to, we do this every couple months or so. I'm not going to read this through, but if you looked at the BDAG entry, and I'll just scroll through this, you'll see we probably learned this in initial, Greek vocabulary. It's and, a marker of connections. But as you scroll through here, it can mean but, or it can mean then. This is a very lengthy entry, and I'm still just on the and part of it. So this is talking about its function, so it can mean also, that's meaning too. I won't belabor this, but just to say it's a flexible word and its context that determines the best way to translate it. You can almost always count on the NET translation, New English Translation, to give you a note for how they translate Kai. You can see it right here, the NET, Mark 12:41. Then, footnote 82, Kai has been translated as then to indicate the implied sequence of events within the narrative. And this is available in accordance. It's also free online, the NET Bible with all of its notes. All right, so that's a lot for one word, but every time we translate Kai, I mean, you can always just default to and leave it provisionally and come back to it. But in the end, once we call our translation finished, or at least a draft, we need to land on something. So it's worth asking every time. So we come next to a participle, kathisas, and then we get some intervening material before we get the main verb, theore. So it looks like this, participle next to verb. You can see that in the, let me get the diagram open here. I'm just going to resize this so it's a little easier to see. All right, so we've got theore, which is shown here as the main verb. Remember, subject is on the left side of this vertical line in the diagram, and the verb, or really the predicate, is on the right side. Now, this diagram is a great example, or this verse is a great example of how these diagrams work. This key, it's just kind of like an X. I guess the formal word for it is a null subject. There's no stated subject in Greek. It is included in the verb. So there's no Greek word per se to put here. Of course, it's Jesus, or we say he, either he or Jesus in translation. But that marker there is just meant to show that. But everything to the right of this vertical line is the predicate. It's what is said about the subject. So if the subject is he or Jesus, what is said about it? Well, it's all of this, all of the rest of the verse. And the main verb is that he was watching, he saw. And then the kathisas, this participle, grammatically is subordinate to the main verb. So the main verb is the main action of the verse. If you were just going to really boil the whole thing down, you know, if you were going to do a Jesus wept version of this verse, it would be Jesus watched. But there's much more than that. That just kind of helps us orient ourselves to the structure. And so this sitting down is a subordinate event to his watching. The kind of main action is his watching, and the sitting down, you can think of it as like the setting. So that's the participle. Now, some translations won't show this subordination in translation. They'll just say, he sat down and watched, as if they're both main verbs. And that's, I think, perfectly fine. But if you wanted to preserve the participle in translation a little bit more formally, you could do something like this. Then, sitting down, Jesus saw. Or then, as he sat down, or then once he had sat down, or then when he sat down. You've got some options here. I like, when possible, to preserve in translation that it's a participle, but again, this is not, I don't think, a major decision in translation, and you'll see different translations doing different things. So that's the setting, is that he's sitting down, and we have more than just sitting down. We've got he's sitting down where? Well, katenanti, opposite to gazafulakiu, the treasury or the offering box. Let's come back to that in just a moment. So we've got then sitting down opposite the offering box, which again, we'll come back to that word. Jesus saw how the crowd was putting money into the collection box. And I already see here something I would change. I've translated the same word different ways in the same verse, which is sometimes warranted. Here it is not. I would go back and revise this so that it's the same both ways. But he's watching the crowd putting money into the collection plate, if you want to use a modern day example. And we have theore pos haaklas bale. And that word balo is going to come up again and again in this passage. If I triple click on it, this isn't, I don't know that this is all in your handout, but if I triple click on balo, you'll see to cause to move, this is BDAG, from one location to another through use of forceful motion, to throw. Now, that is the first definition here. It's not the only definition. It can also mean, here's a more forceful version of it, like expel, but it can also have this like softer meaning of to put or place something in a location. Put, place, apply, lay, bring. And how would you know which meaning is applicable? Well, it would be the context. And so, you know, BDAG kind of gives us their interpretation here of which one it is. They put our passage under definition number 3. Put, which is why I did not translate it. People were throwing money into the temple treasury. Now, it may be, and this is not the case that I'm aware of, but it may be, you know, that historically, culturally, if that was how people gave money and you did the research and found that out, then you'd want to translate it as throw. But this is not something, people don't throw their money into the temple treasury. They're putting it in. There's something a little bit more reverent than just the, tossing it in, casting it in. So even though balo can mean throw in this first definition, and even though it can also have this more intensive meaning of drive out, expel, in this case, it would appear that the most appropriate translation is just the kind of more neutral put or set or place, or we've got lay or bring or take, something along those lines. So that's balo. That's what the people are doing, and Jesus is seeing that. So back to the diagrams, what he is seeing. Now this whole thing here is the content of what Jesus is seeing. He is seeing, and then this other line shows us this is the direct object now. He's seeing the crowd putting money into the temple collection area. And the post here is how. This makes it a little trickier to translate. You could do something like, he saw how the crowd was putting money. Post is almost functioning as a that here. Like he saw that the crowd was putting money. I don't think post is functioning with the force of, like, he saw the method they were using to give money. The how there is not, it's not talking about the way in which they were giving money. I don't think. I think it's just this, and we do this in English too. Like, I saw how they were coming up the street, and then I greeted them. You're not talking about the way that they're walking. You just saw that they were coming up the street, and so you greeted them. So post here has that force. Some translations don't even translate it. Like the NET just has watched the crowd putting coins into it. Post does not get a translation. NASB observing how the people were putting. So that's just a minor decision to make. Note that balo is in the present, active indicative. We can see this from the instant details if we don't remember our inflections. We'll come back to this verb a number of times, but the reason it's in the present is that it is what he is seeing in the present moment. So it's describing this as he's seeing it in real time. And if you wanted to preserve that in translation, that would be a little trickier. But I think if you don't translate post as how, something like he saw the crowd putting, and then if you don't have was is past tense in English. So you could say he saw the crowd putting money, if you wanted to bring that present tense into English a little bit more. But it strikes me that there's a little bit of a trade-off here with both preserving the how and the present tense of this. It's language just does not translate one-to-one. So that's why you'll see different translations that either have how, the crowd, but then you have to use was, or maybe they'll just say saw the crowd putting. A very kind of literal translation, so to speak, would be he saw how the crowd is putting money into the collection box. That just doesn't make sense in English. So that would be fine for an interlinear. I would not advise that for a final translation. So you need something here. But it's worth looking at this and kind of tarrying with it for a moment before you actually land on a translation. All right, so Jesus saw the crowd putting the money in, and I just note here with balo, we talked about that in BDAG a little bit. It occurs twice in this verse. It's going to continue to occur in this passage. I would simply advise using the same English translation in every case, provided that they're all putting money into the offering plate in the same way. If you had reason to believe that the rich people were throwing the money victoriously into the offering plate, then you might say, and many rich people tossed in a lot. I don't think we have enough context to determine that. I think this is just they're putting their money in too. Not every translation agrees with that. Interestingly, the NET, and there's no note here, but it has, he watched the crowd putting, that's balo, so they're putting, to put money in. And the rich people are also baloing, but in this translation, they're throwing in large amounts. NASB does putting, to preserve balo here. I can see the reasoning behind both. I think I've tried to explain from my vantage point. I would favor keeping the translation the same so that somebody reading your translation, and it might just be you, 3 months from now, can see it's the same word all throughout. So by the time you get to the end of this passage, I think it's like 5 times it occurs. If you see in English putting, that's helpful to kind of preserve what's going on in the Greek. At the same time, if you conclude from sitting with this passage, and this is, maybe consulting some commentary, some historical backgrounds, if your conclusion is the rich people are kind of cavalierly actually throwing the money in, then translate it that way. I don't think we have enough to conclude that. Obviously, you can feel free to disagree. This, in defense of this throwing in translation, we do have people kind of being ostentatious just a few verses prior. The experts in the law, the long robes, the elaborate greetings, the best seats, the places of honor, the devouring of widows' property, the long prayers. And yeah, that person would probably also, they might actually throw their money in or try to make it make a loud noise or something like that. It's not the exact same group of people. This is the experts in the law here. This is rich people. So I guess I can see where this is coming from. It's not my first choice, but I'm also very open to disagreement on this. But in general, though, I think the principle is if you have the same word in the same verse or same passage and it's functioning the same way and means the same thing, just be careful to bring that out in English. I have failed that principle through a bit of human error here by rendering the same Greek word that is the same collection box with different translations. So that's something I will go back and revise. And we'll come back to that word in just a minute. But let me pause there. We won't spend as much time on balo every time it comes up, but it does continue to come up. And already you have at least a potential difference here in how you translate it, or not. But I wanted to do that much of this verse before we move on. That we'll spend some time talking about how to translate offering box or treasury. But let me respond. I see some comments and questions here. Yeah, here's a great comment, and these came in a little while ago, so I'm catching up on these. Somebody says, I put this in the chat, I think he did mean the forcefulness of throwing the money, as he is suggesting the difference between the rich and the poor in their humility. Yeah, for sure. I think if that's sort of how you're reading this, I think what's hard for me about this is there's just not much information about the rich people here. But that certainly makes sense. And that is, as I said, consistent with the behavior of somebody who's being ostentatious. And I imagine that's why the NET went that way. It doesn't say. I wish they had, but this would be a great place to check your commentaries. Some of them will weigh in on this explicitly, others will not. Your mileage will vary. I always like to go to the SIL Exegetical Summary series and see if they have anything. They do putting and putting. Now this translation here tends to be very wooden and very sort of, I guess, cautious is maybe the word, and then they tease it out here more underneath, but we're not getting a whole lot from that. But this would probably be worth comparing. Hopefully one of your commentaries speaks to whether the rich people are throwing in the money or not, or they may not. They may not speak to that at all. Yeah, this doesn't weigh in at all. It just says putting or throwing balo, and that's Strauss, which is the original language. I don't know that France even says anything about this either. You will find, by the way, this is my personal experience, and I wonder if yours matches, but there are some really good technical Greek-specific commentaries. I often refer to R.T. France, Zondervan Exegetical Commentary. Gundry is another one. Even so, there are Greek questions that just don't get treated. And I think you'll find that as you continue on in the work of translation. this is probably a good time to consider checking your info pane and seeing if your grammars have anything on these verses, and they very well may. Yeah, we'll come back to this in just a moment. Let me just see what other questions there are. I'm going to bookmark that thought for now. Okay, here's some notes that all came in one comment. I'm just going to put these anonymously into the chat from a user. Someone says, Kai is continuative from verse 40, devouring widows' houses. Balo means to cast, throw. This forceful aspect is intended. We're putting twice present tense first and second time is imperfect tense, marks an extra emphasis. Yeah, much like ostentatious method of showing the wad of dollar bills in the offering plate. Yeah, that's a great modern day example. Here's another comment. Someone says, historically, these offering boxes were identified as trumpet-shaped drop entrances to accentuate the sound of many metal coins. Yeah, we'll come back to that in just a moment. Let me just go back to the throwing or putting. In fact, I'm going to rearrange my workspace a little bit here to make this a little easier to read. I went to the info pane and saw what grammars, what my grammars had on 1241. So here's Decker, who he's not really treating it per se there. Let's see what else he's got. The crowd threw money. All right, that's interesting. Now he's talking about imperfective aspect. So he says through here, but he doesn't say why. So and this is what I mean. Decker is a master at this, but he's addressing another question, so I'm not faulting him for this. He's talking about something else, which we may come back to. Yeah, if you are finding secondary resources about this put versus throw, I'd love to know about it. Otherwise, I'm just going to leave it off for now and just note that I'm sure even among us we'd have different approaches. Even within myself, I can go back and forth on this. So that's fine. That's part of the fun and challenge of translation. So we'll leave that for now. Noting though that Balo in general, if we can translate it the same way throughout the passage, we will, with this possible exception of how the rich people are giving, if we think there is good grounds for understanding their giving to kind of physically be different from the others. And for that, maybe some more extended historical research would be required. All right, so this receptacle, what is it that they're giving into? I triple click this and I can find it in BDAG here. BDAG gives us two kind of primary meaning possibilities for gazo-phulakion, and you can see here in the roots this phulakion that has to do with guarding or keeping, and the gaza would be, I guess, something money. I don't know that root, but you can search for the roots. So there's phulatho, having to do with guarding or keeping. Not sure I'm going to find this anywhere. Well, that's a place name. All right, well, anyway, so gazo here having to do something with money or coins, but the phulakion having to do with keeping it. So it's like a receptacle. But we get these two meanings in BDAG. Number one, a place for the storing of valuables, treasure room, treasury. And then we've got some kind of more historical background here. And then they put contribution box or receptacle as translation equivalents here. And here's one user was commenting about the trumpet shape. Here's more on that. There were in the temple 13 such receptacles in the form of trumpets, but even in these passages, the general sense of treasury is probably for the contributions would go the treasury via the receptacles. Yeah, all right. So I've put some more content about that in your handout. BDAG, and then also Evans, Craig Evans from Word Biblical Commentary, and RT France from his commentary. He notes, and I thought this was interesting, that the reference here to the collecting chest in the court of women is demanded by the context, which has an aklas, a crowd, including a woman throwing in donations. Again, he doesn't say why throwing versus putting, but that's not the point he's making. He's making the point that there is a woman here, and so this puts us at a very specific part of the temple. And so the treasury, as referred to in these other sources, is not what's in view. It's just a collection area that's being discussed. This probably requires following these hyperlinks. I mean, if I were to be kind of more fully confident in my translation, I'd want to do more work around this. You may wish to do the same. But I think that the general idea, and again, this is where backing way out can be helpful. What story is Mark trying to tell here? Well, he's not telling a story about the method or the physical expressions people had when they were giving. He's not even telling a story about, you know, the shape and kind of physicality of the thing that they're giving into, the receptacle. Those are all important details, but he's telling about, you know, the how that Mark is interested in here has to do with giving from the heart and giving all that you've got versus just something that's like nothing to give. So all of that said, I do think rigor and being thorough is important here. I think Mark himself, though, is more using this gazophulakion as a place, a site of giving. I think contribution box is a perfectly fine translation here. But you've got lots of hyperlinks here to further research this, and you may already agree or already disagree or want to think through this some more on your own. Either way, don't repeat the mistake I made of translating it the same way in the same verse. I'm translating it a different way in the same verse, offering box, collection box. I would just pick the one and stick with it however you translate it. All right, so this is a lot of setup for the passage. We will obviously have to spend less time on each verse. It concludes with many rich people put in a lot, or throwing. We've kind of wrestled with that a little bit already. Pala here is an adjective, although it can function as a noun, just like in English, and I've tried to preserve that in English. Many people put in a lot, but you could kind of bring out the noun that it modifies if you take this as an adjective. So you could, in your translation, say, many rich people put in a lot of kalkan, money. We didn't look at this word, but you could decide whether you wanted to be a little bit more physically specific, like metal coins. You could do that in translation, or contribution or donation or money more broadly. You'll see BDAG kind of gives us those various options here. But here the pala, of course, refers to large sums of money, but it doesn't explicitly have the noun. So that's yet another decision to make in translation. You can get decision fatigue in translation, but it's just part of the work that we have to decide at every turn how we're going to render different things. Notice too, and I don't know how you would bring this out in translation. Maybe you don't. If you can, great. But there's some alliteration here. Paloi, plusioi, ebalan, pala with the P. If you can bring that into English, great. That's notoriously difficult. You see that a lot with the Psalms. Can you preserve poetry? Well, yeah, we sure try. Can you preserve idioms? Maybe, maybe not. What about alliteration? Give it a shot. Maybe you can think of some alliterative way to say the same thing that's still faithful to the Greek text. But I've gone with a pretty colloquial translation here. Many rich people put in a lot. So I will stop there again and check in with you. These have been great comments so far, and so I welcome any others about this verse. Let me just put my translation up here again. Then, sitting down opposite the offering box, Jesus saw how the crowd was putting money into the offering box, and many rich people put in a lot. This, by the way, sounds redundant, doesn't it? Then sitting down opposite the offering box, Jesus saw how the crowd was putting money into the offering box. I don't remember which translation now. Oh, it's right here. The NET says, he sat down opposite the offering box and watched the crowd putting coins into it. That's much more natural English, I think. But because this noun is repeated here in Greek, and because Greek doesn't often do that, I repeat it in translation. But you do have this option. Just sort of depends on what your goals are in translation. Any other comments or questions on this verse before we move into the heart of the story? All right, verse 42. So now we have the main character of the story come onto the scene. Kai Elthusa, Mia, Kera Ptoke, Ebalin Lepta Duo, Ha Estin Cadrantes. And let's get our diagrams open again. Move this down. All right. So we've got the subject at the left here. We've got a widow. Mia means one, and Ptoke means poor. So one poor widow. And then the main action here is Balo. You kind of see a theme here with Balo uniting these different actions. And what she threw in, the direct object, is to lepta. And the Elthusa is the participle again here. So if you wanted to kind of preserve that as woodenly or as strictly, I should say, as possible in English, it would be something like, and coming along, a poor widow put in. But you'll see just as many translations treat that Elthusa as a main verb. A poor widow came and put in. Nothing is lost there in the meaning. In fact, I did that here as well. And one poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a cent. I don't address this in the translation notes, and if you have questions or especially comments or insights, I'd love to hear them. But translating when it comes to money is a unique challenge because we don't have the same currency as what these people had that were putting money into the offering plate. So different translations will deal with this differently, and probably the way forward here has something to do with your footnotes. You know, 2 lepta, that is 2 small copper coins. You know, you might just transliterate it in translation, or you see this with the use of the word denarius in Jesus's parable. That is a day's wages, or however you want to do that. So I just kind of note that as a particular challenge here. The way that you would start this is by looking it up in a lexicon, I would think. And here we've got small copper coin, 1/128th of a denarius. So you could decide that you're just going to translate it small copper coin. The meaning of this is that it's not very much. That's explicitly noted with this almost a parenthetical statement. It's not parenthetical, it's explanatory. But you might also want to put the exact amount in, because if you reason, well, whoever, you know, the disciples, whoever saw these 2 small copper coins, they would translate that to, you know, that's 26 cents or whatever it is. Maybe you want to do that in translation. So money is kind of interesting in translation, I think, because you want to think about, do you preserve the currency? Do you kind of go more broadly and say 2 small copper coins? Or do you translate it literally into today's currency? Now that makes your translation less timeless and less transcultural, but maybe that's fine. Maybe you're translating for today for a particular context and culture, and that's fine. So there's some math you could do here. How much is a denarius? Right click, go to research, search denarius in all of your stuff that you've got in accordance, find the amount. Again, here you've got like the Berean Study Bible, great example. They preserve it, actually transliterate it. They give you a day's wage for a laborer. So, you know, take your whatever salary, yearly, divide that by 365, and then divide that by 128. So at this point, maybe you give up and say, well, the math really doesn't matter. This is a pittance, I think would be the word here. And maybe you still want to do the math, so you can go do it, but it's a very small amount here. So that's just kind of a convoluted way of saying money requires a series of decisions in translation. I've just gone with 2 small copper coins. This is also a well-known enough story that I think typically translators, and you may not agree with this approach, but typically translation committees will be more reluctant to change kind of accepted meanings or translations of verses that are well known. So John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, only begotten son. That word one and only begotten has some translation challenges. What does that word mean? But it's so well known in a certain translation that committees tend to be reluctant to kind of adjust that. Now, again, you may disagree with that, but and I may too, for that matter. But in this case, I think the 2 small copper coins, the 2 coins in particular, the 2 widow's mites, as some translations might say, I think just preserving it that way is great. I would not kind of sweat the actual dollars and cents of this. Although that said, we get this explanatory remark, which are worth a cent. And so we have another kind of embedded money translation question. So triple clicking here, I get quadrans or penny, smallest Roman coin. And so we have cent or penny in English that will work. You may think about something, and maybe the word might factors in somewhere here. But the ha estin is clarifying, for whatever reason, presumably maybe Mark's readers don't know what a lepta is, or maybe Mark just wants to emphasize this. I think that would be worth checking the commentaries for. But the point here, we are very clear by the end of verse 42 that she's giving next to nothing. And if you were doing a more colloquial translation or even an explanatory note, that phrase next to nothing or just about nothing or virtually nothing, some kind of way of bringing that out, I think the focus for Mark and then Jesus is less on the currency or the type of metal or how much it was worth. The fact that it was worth almost nothing, that's really the thrust of this verse. So thinking about how we bring that out in translation is the way to go. I just will make one note about the grammar of this verse and then checking with you all for questions or comments. I've highlighted this ha estin quadrantes, which are worth a cent. Interestingly, lepta duo, that's plural. The duo makes that clear because it's 2, but the lepta, we've got that a ending, that alpha ending in the neuter plural accusative. But then what is said about it, and you can even see this in the diagrams with the dotted line, the relative pronoun ha is singular, and the verb estin is singular as well. So if you were looking at this from an interlinear perspective, it would say something like 2 coins, which is a penny. But in English, and even typically in Greek, there's what's called concord or agreement of number between subject and verb, 2 coins which are. So we should have the plural relative pronoun and the plural verb here if we're thinking strictly in terms of number. It turns out this is a actual grammatical rule, and I've put this in your handout here. Schema Atticum, Latin, the grammatical rule of classical Greek writers that a neuter plural subject takes a singular verb. The New Testament writers usually followed the rule with a non-personal or abstract noun, but not with personal nouns. That is exactly what's going on here. We have a neuter plural, and it's not personal, it's a thing, it's an inanimate object, 2 small copper coins, lepta, duo, neuter plural, and it's taking a singular verb, and in fact, a singular relative pronoun. All I could remember when I was preparing for today was that the neuter plural does this sometimes. I couldn't remember what it was called. So I went to my library. I went to the Greek New Testament. In fact, I don't know that I've ever heard that Latin name for it. There's probably another name for it, but I went to my Pocket New Testament Greek Dictionary. If you're curious how you might look up something similar, I went to English content and I typed in neuter plural, and it took me right to this. So I thought that was kind of handy. So there it is. That is actually as expected if you know that rule. It's not at first. I mean, it sort of threw me for a loop. You know, I thought this was plural. You know, duo confirms that. I'm seeing it in the instant details, and now we've got ha, which is singular. So you know, you're still right about all those parsings and inflections. It's just the neuter plural takes the singular verb. All right, we'll probably do these last two verses. Yeah, definitely more briefly on verse 43 and a little bit more time on verse 44. But let me check in with you and see what comments or questions you've got. Let me put this comment and question in the chat. Somebody says, how can the widow cast imperfect tense two very tiny coins? More is implied, I suspect. Does this relate to her purposeful reverential attitude behind her action versus the imperfect tense casting of the very rich with the plentiful offerings? Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I wonder about this, and I didn't put much more than just kind of a note here in the handout. But I'm glad you're pointing out the different tense or the aspect here that Balo, the first time the crowd, Jesus sees the crowd is giving or putting or throwing or however we translate it. That's present active indicative. It's describing what he's seeing in the present tense. It's like this ongoing action. You get the image of a crowd kind of lining up to do it. Balo, the second time, is imperfect active indicative, and that tends to, I mean, there's lots of ways to understand the imperfect, but again, it's kind of this idea, I think, of ongoing iterative action. They're doing it repeatedly. Here we get Balo in the aorist active indicative. Typically, aorist has to do with an action being viewed as a complete whole. And this is a one-time event too, you know, so in contrast to the line of people giving and the rich people giving over and over, here we've got this aorist kind of one-time event. So I do think, and it's described as like a complete act here in a way that these other ones are more kind of ongoing. So yes, I think this is a way of kind of coming alongside this comment, at least, to say, I wonder if Mark is doing this on purpose. It could just be poetic variation, but it seems to me that even with the same word Balo, the fact that she gets an aorist while the others don't, I think that itself, I mean, you would, a native Greek speaker would catch that. So I think that's doing something here. I don't want to overread it, and so I'd want to think about this more. But I think there may be something to that, and certainly, yeah, as this is noted in this comment, it could extend to something more than that too. You know, that as this comment says, her purposeful, reverential attitude behind her action. So yeah, thanks for that comment. Great. Oh, interesting. Yeah, someone says, put this in the chat, a curious parallel. Arabic has also that grammatical issue with using a singular yeah, singular verb must be for plural subject if non-human. That's really interesting. Pretty sure Hebrew does that too, and I'm blanking on that. I know there's another name for this device that I learned somewhere. At least I think there is. It wasn't schema adicum, but yeah, that may be true in other languages as well. Yeah, great comments. Well, feel free to keep them coming. I'm going to continue on into verse 43. Now, this is the meaning of the passage, and so you know, I don't find the translation of this terribly difficult, but it is really important for understanding the meaning of the passage. Let's just look at the Greek straight through first. Kai proskale samenas tus mathetas autu. So we have, and calling his disciples Apen autois, he said to them, Amen lego humin, truly I tell you, hati, that, hekera haute, heptoke. So the widow, the poor, but it's really this poor widow. Pleion, panton, ebalin ton balanton, es ta gazofulakion. This poor widow, more than all through or put in those who gave into the offering box. All right, we're going to have to unpack this a little bit. Really, word order is the issue here. Here's a smoother translation. And calling his disciples, Jesus said to them, Jesus isn't named there, but it doesn't hurt. Truly, I tell you that this poor widow put more into the offering box than all the other givers. Now, we've seen this multiple times. R.T. France points this out often. I didn't check his commentary on this verse. I'm guessing it's there. But this is a rhetorical device. I mean, it's also, Mark's describing it as a true historical event that Jesus pulls the disciples aside to explain something for their benefit. And Mark uses this to explain something for the reader's benefit. It's like we get this inside view of what's going on that, you would have had to be in the inner circle to get this description of a very public event. It's almost a private, he's not trying to hide it, but I mean, it is an aside. It's not a publicly taught lesson here. This is to the disciples. And so Mark, who wants his readers to become disciples, wants the readers also to hear this. And we've seen that multiple times. So I just note that to say that, we want to treat this kind of at the surface level of it's being explained to the disciples, and there's that kind of broader meaning of it being for all listeners and readers. Again, balo, twice more here. Once to describe the woman, he uses it again in the aorist, Jesus does, as Mark did in verse 32. And now here it's a participle, a noun, ton balanton, the putter inners, the ones who put in. And here is where I have not done this perfectly, but maybe you consider revising your translation for consistency, using a word that works across the passage. So whether it's giving or throwing, or whether you think the rich people threw and the other people gave, I would just suggest that this balo here, some way to have it be consistent with the other way you've translated. Now, I have not done that here. And so givers here, it's a good translation, I think. It may obscure that balo is still being used. So maybe I go back and say, all right, does give work for balo or contribute in the previous verses? Or is there some way to preserve the word put here, if I like that translation for earlier? So this is where, going left to right, verse by verse is valuable, but there's always going to be revision in the process, especially as you see a word come up and you do this consistency check, for lack of a better word. All right, let me move on to verse 44, and I'll welcome comments and questions too on verse 43. We did not spend as much time on this. There's, like I said, I don't think there's a lot of translation issues. If you see any, let me know. But I mean, it's, not to downplay the depth of significance of this verse. I mean, this is really a powerful statement. And in fact, it's a statement that would seem to raise a question. In what way is it true, Jesus? Because Jesus says, Amen, Lego, truly I tell you. So it's like, hey guys, I really mean this. Hey everyone, listen to this. This is true. True story. This poor widow put more into the offering box than all the other givers. And I think Jesus anticipates, or maybe in real time sees befuddled looks on faces, because he goes to Gar next to ground this statement. This poor widow put more into the offering box, and I'm guessing at least one disciple thought, no, I saw how much she put in. It was not more. Well, Jesus says Gar. It's a grounding statement. We translate it just simply with for, but it has the force of saying, this poor widow put in more. And the reason she put in more, the fact that makes this statement true, is that they all out of their abundance gave, but she out of her poverty gave everything she had, her whole livelihood. That's the way in which it is true that she gave more. And in translation, 3 letters in Greek just so happens to be 3 in English, 4. But if you were unpacking this in a discussion context or even your own notes, I would spend time on this 4 here, this grounding thing, because this, I think, is counterintuitive, even to us today who know this story. Money talks, as they say. Money is important. There's nothing inherently wrong about it. It's how it's used, but I think we're all susceptible to measuring it solely in real dollar terms. Jesus is saying that's not the only way to think about this. So let's spend a little bit of time. We have a few minutes here for verse 44. Pantes gar ectu perisuantas autois ebalan, haute de ectes husteretheos autes, panta hasa echin ebalen. There's that aorist again with balo, very consistent every time she's mentioned as putting in. It's 3 times in the aorist. Halan tan bian autes. So left to right, they all out of wealth or abundance, out of their wealth or abundance gave or put in or contributed. But this one, out of her poverty, all that she had, she gave. That is her whole, I would say livelihood, but that's not quite the right nuance. The sum total of what she had to live on. And I do say her whole livelihood here. I'm not sure that's the best translation, but here's at least a draft of a translation. They all out of their abundance gave. For they all out of their abundance gave, but she out of her poverty gave everything she had, her whole livelihood, her whole kit and caboodle, if you want to be super colloquial, although maybe nobody knows what that means, so maybe that's a bad translation. But the point is she gave everything. And notice too, I didn't note this in the translation notes here, but just as we had, she gave 2 small copper coins and then an explanatory comment. It really was almost nothing. Here we have, she gave everything she had. Another explanatory comment. It really was everything. I think there's something there that's worth tarrying with and unpacking. Certainly that will preach, as they say. Note here the word order, and I kind of split the difference on this translation. I try to preserve it as much as possible for what we're doing today, and I kind of lined it up here, but it goes like this. For they all out of their abundance gave, but she out of her poverty, everything she had gave, her whole livelihood. This will not work very well as a final English translation. In fact, you probably will see some rearranging. They all gave out of their wealth. She gave out of her poverty, something like that. Here is what the Greek looks like, though, preserving the word order as much as possible in English. And I point that out to say you've got this gar and they that are parallel, they all and she. So pantes and haute, this one, that's parallel. Out of their abundance, out of her poverty, that's parallel. So you would almost expect gave to come next here. For they all out of their abundance gave, but she out of her poverty, fill in the blank, gave. Mark doesn't do that. Instead, we have everything she had, she gave. And then yet more, her whole livelihood. I think that panta hasa ekin, it is, it interrupts that parallel flow, and I think that's for focus or emphasis, and there's yet more emphasis here. So Mark / Jesus wants this to be, and I think I should have put quotation marks here. This is still Jesus speaking. The point here is she gave 100%, absolutely everything. No doubt about it. Nothing left to give. She gave everything she could. And there are lots of ways you could think about translating that. Even giving one of the 2 coins would be 50%, and that would be a lot because that would be 5 times the 10% tithe. But she's doing everything. She's giving everything, and she is the exemplar that Jesus is holding up to the disciples, that Mark is holding up for all would-be disciples and readers and listeners of giving. They all out of their abundance gave, she out of her poverty, and there's some irony there, everything she had, she gave, her whole livelihood. And I just note here, we don't have time for this today, but verse 40 had talked about widows and how they had been economically exploited. Was this widow economically exploited by a teacher of the law? Quite possibly. I mean, the end result of economic exploitation is having next to nothing, and that's what this woman has. Now, Jesus doesn't say that, Mark doesn't say that, and I don't know. There's no way to prove that, but there is a connection here thematically and at the word level, the same word for widow, the widow who is being exploited as a class of people, this protected class, this class that God names and calls out to God's people. These are ones that you should preserve, you should protect, you should honor. They're being exploited. And this woman is also an exemplar of giving, in contrast to the people, broadly described as a crowd, and in contrast to the rich, and even in contrast to the previously mentioned teachers of the law who are exploiting this class. All right, I'll stop there. I know we've gone a little bit over time, and I do want to be respectful of your time. Obviously, you're always free to come and go. I'm going to stop the recording now. I will stay on for a couple more minutes if you want to stay on for any questions. But just to reiterate, if you're watching the recording, you can email me here, showing on the screen, abramkj@accordancebible.com. And of course, those of you here live are welcome to do that as well. I always enjoy interacting with folks. And then tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes has this handout and all the others from this series.